Don, you have an idea of how many people this actually captures?
No. Every time, I'm always asked the same question, and the answer is no.
The Liberals have just introduced Bill C-3 that aims to grant citizenship to Canadians that have been born abroad, even if their parents were not born in Canada but had lived here for a certain period of time. We actually covered this exact same legislation over a year ago when it was Bill C-71, and we wanted to ensure that you had all of the facts as there are still issues with it.
Let's take a look. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Bill C-3, an act to amend the Citizenship Act 2025, Minister of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship. First reading to occur today, June 5th, 2025. This enactment amends the Citizenship Act to, among other things, ensure that citizenship by descent is conferred on all persons who were born outside of Canada before the coming into force of this enactment to a parent who was a citizen. Confer citizenship by descent on persons born outside of Canada after the first generation on or after the coming into force of this enactment to a parent who is a citizen and who had a substantial connection to Canada before the person's birth. Allow citizenship to be granted under Section 5.1 of the Act to all persons born outside of Canada who were adopted before the coming into force of this enactment by a parent who was a citizen. Allow citizenship to be granted under Section 5.1 of the Act to persons born outside of Canada who were adopted on or after the coming into force of this enactment by a parent who is a citizen and who had a substantial connection to Canada before the person's adoption. Restore citizenship to persons who lost their citizenship because they did not make an application to retain it under the former Section 8 of the Act, or because they made an application under the section that was not approved, and allow certain persons who become citizens as a result of the coming into force of this enactment to access a simplified process to renounce their citizenship. Now, as we said, this is Bill C-3. This is Bill C-71.
And this is from the previous Parliament, Parliament 44.
Now, why are we talking about this? Well, because we've already talked about this. We're talking about this now because we've talked about this before, and sometimes these pieces of legislation can get lost in the shuffle. People forget about them. Frankly, I think I forgot about it until C-3 made its appearance again, but there's a lot of, let's just call it misinformation about the bill. The bill is actually addressing an issue that was raised as a result of a Superior Court challenge a while ago.
So this all started back in 2023 when the Ontario Superior Court had made the ruling that you cannot have it where there are two different classes of citizens. One class where they pass their citizenship onto their offspring, and one class that does not. So let's look at two examples. Example number one, both Ryan and I were born here in Canada. That's not hypothetical, we were. And say hypothetically, Ryan gets a new job and goes down to the States, and we as a family move down to the States. Now let's say that I give birth to a child down in the States. That child would be granted Canadian citizenship because Ryan and I were both born here in Canada. So that's scenario one. So let's look at a hypothetical scenario number two, completely made up. Say that Ryan and I were both born abroad, came to Canada when we were very small, got Canadian citizenship, lived here our entire lives, and then decided that we needed to move to the United States for Ryan to get a job, go to work. And then I had a child who was born in the States. Now, because Ryan and I, hypothetically, were not born in Canada, and this child, again, hypothetically, was also not born in Canada, we could not pass our Canadian citizenship onto that child because neither Ryan nor I were born in Canada, hypothetically. So this is the exact scenario that it's trying to prevent. It's trying to prevent two different classes of Canadian citizenship, one class that can pass its citizenship on to its children, and one class that cannot, based solely on where the parents were born.
Now, where did this all come from? Let's take a look. So, back in 2023, as Tony said, Ontario's Superior Court of Justice has ruled it's unconstitutional for Canada to deny automatic citizenship to children born abroad to parents who were also born overseas but have a substantial connection to Canada. A big quote-unquote win for lost Canadians trying to reclaim citizenship rights. In a 55-page ruling released this week, Justice Jasmine Akbarali found that the second-generation cutoff rule violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms because it, quote, treats differently those Canadians who became Canadians at birth because they were born in Canada from those Canadians who obtained their citizenship by descent on their birth outside of Canada. The federal government has until June 19th to act after Ontario Superior Court of Justice ruled in September it was unconstitutional to deny Canadians born abroad the right to pass on their citizenship to their foreign-born offspring. Ottawa chose not to challenge the ruling. Unless the government challenges the law by that date and establishes a test for ties to Canada, foreign-born children of foreign-born Canadians, even if they have never stepped foot in Canada, could qualify for citizenship.
And just to clarify, June 19th, that was listed in that excerpt that we just read, was June 19th, 2024, so last year. We have our original episode, which was a live stream, linked in the comments below. And in that, you can see that Mark Miller was saying we have until June 19th to enact this law. And that's what it's talking about. It was June 19th of 2024. Now, because Parliament went on summer break and then they came back and there was really only a month, not even a month, there was like 2 or 3 weeks of legislation before the House got shut down because the Liberals refused to hand over the SCTC documents. And then we went to prorogation and then we went to election and now we're finally back legislating. That's why this has taken a year to address.
Now, the issue is they had until that June 19th to get this going. Otherwise, and this is why the bill actually went in, and when we talked about this the first time, this was actually a good thing that the Liberals were putting this in, because if they didn't put this bill in, every single person who would have subsequently been, denied citizenship would have just automatically been given citizenship status. Everybody.
Right. And Canadian citizenship is special. You don't want to give it to just anybody. Now, why all of this kind of happened in the first place, you have to go all the way back to 2006, where the Harper government was responsible for evacuating people between the Israel and Hezbollah war. And many of them had claimed Canadian citizenship, but had never even stepped foot in Canada. They had termed them Canadians of convenience, where they only had citizenship through their parents and really had no direct ties to our country. The government spent a lot of money to evacuate these people. And the question became, are people who have never stepped foot in Canada really citizens? Should we be spending Canadian tax dollars? Should we be using Canadian military to extricate people from a foreign war where they live, like they lived overseas? They didn't live in Canada. They weren't on vacation. They weren't there for work. That was their permanent residency. Should we be extricating those people at the cost to Canadian taxpayers? And that's why the Harper government they enacted that first generation cutoff rule. But in 2023, that's when the courts decided that it was not constitutional, and the Liberal government did not challenge that ruling. And that's why we have this law now.
So the question is what happened with that June 19th cutoff that happened last year? Well, the government receives its fourth extension to fix constitutional lost Canadians issues.
The federal government has received a fourth extension to pass legislation to grant citizenship to quote-unquote lost Canadians after the existing law was ruled unconstitutional. Quote-unquote lost Canadians is a term applied to people who were born outside of the country to Canadian parents who were also born in another country. In 2009, the Conservative federal government of the day changed the law so that Canadians who were born abroad could not pass down their citizenship unless their child was born in Canada. The Ontario Superior Court of Justice ruled in late 2023 that the law was unconstitutional, and the government agreed with the ruling. The government introduced citizenship legislation meant to remedy the issue in March 2024, 1 month before the original deadline, but the bill did not pass Parliament before it was dissolved. The government applied for a 1-year extension, but Justice Jasmine Akbarali set a deadline of November 20th, 2025 at 11:59 p.m. In her decision, she said that should be enough time for the next government to implement, quote, remedial legislation, end quote, if it makes it a quote-unquote priority. Sujit Chowdhury, a lawyer representing some of the quote-unquote lost Canadians, said that Akbar Ali has been, quote, incredibly patient, end quote, with the government and has given them, quote, more than enough time, end quote, to pass the legislation. Quote, it's a matter of public record that the government mismanaged the parliamentary agenda with this file, and the court made a finding to that fact in their December 2024 decision, end quote, he said. Quote, I hope now that the government will redouble its efforts to reprioritize this legislation and ensure its passage in the next parliament, because this process can't run on forever, end quote. Akbar Ali has criticized the Liberal government in her decisions, saying she's granted the extensions because of the potential for harm caused by the Harper-era legislation being declared invalid.
Now, there's some questions around, what does this mean? What is Canadians of convenience? And we just want to go back to the press conference that was held last year so Mark Miller can actually answer these questions for you.
Don, you have an idea of how many people this actually captures?
No. Every time, I'm always asked the same question, and the answer is no.
Oh.
No, I don't know. I'm always asked the same question, and nobody knows. I do know that Bill C-37 captured over 1 million people. How many people came to Canada? 17,000. And that probably most of the people were already in Canada. But it does justify some things. Like the first time Elizabeth and I talked, she discovered her mother was nothing but chattel in Canadian law. So this validates her mother. So, well, that won't be a citizenship issue. It will be honor of the crown, if you will. And a feminist issue, well, which is a human rights issue. So, no, I don't know, but a lot of people.
The bill sets a 3-year threshold cumulatively for presence in Canada. Can you tell us how you came up with that number? And I'm just wondering if everyone here who spoke would meet that threshold.
Yeah, it's the threshold under the naturalization law. It's quite simple. It's sort of a convention. I think it is a reasonable limit to what is a substantial connection to Canada. As I mentioned in my speech, citizenship isn't for everyone, and there is a point at which people lose connection to Canada. Certainly in the cases of these fine people behind me, that is absolutely not the case, not even close. And I would venture to think that they would qualify based on their personal stories. Look, this is about, this is about numbers, yes, and putting a reasonable approach onto something that was unreasonable, unfair, and unconstitutional. But it's also the personal stories of the people behind me, and I think they spoke quite eloquently about them. It's a story of 2 young kids whose mother was killed in a terrorist attack by Hamas, who would not be Canadian citizens but for this law, or but for perhaps a discretion that I would have to use. But a minister's discretion shouldn't be a way to determine whose people have rights and who don't.
Are you anticipating you might have to use discretion for someone who, say, spent 2.5 years in Canada instead of 3?
You always have to look at the circumstances as they arise, and it's something that obviously my team looks at quite intensely. And again, I'd have to have a real life scenario in front of me to comment on it.
There are concerns about so-called Canadians of convenience, folks who want to use the advantages of being a Canadian citizen without necessarily taking part in the daily life of this country. What kind of evidence are you going to require from folks to become citizens under this new bill? What are the mechanisms?
And it's important. It's an important point that, again, citizenship isn't for everyone, and there are at times people that want to gain Canadian citizenship by convenience. We believe that the naturalization test and substantial connection test is one that creates that connection to Canada. We believe that it's fair, and we believe that it's compliant. Again, I'm not a judge. I don't sit in a court, but again, we will have to address that in due course as it arises. The citizenship is very much a privilege that needs to be earned in a lot of circumstances, but certainly not in these cases where it was just patently unfair to begin with, and the law that was passed in 2009 manifestly unfair, as Don said, as the court said.
Just a clarification, is it 3 years overarchingly, 3 years within a specific period?
It doesn't have to be consecutive over a period.
So some issues that obviously still exist with this bill is How many people would be granted citizenship under this bill?
They don't
They
know.
have no idea.
Granted, this was last year. Maybe they do know the answer now, but we haven't seen it anywhere.
Yeah, so that's one. Number two is, what is a substantial connection? Well, it seems to be that you have to spend 3 years in Canada.
In your entire life.
Right. So this is a issue because you could come here for a year, then go away for 10 years, come here for another year, go away for 10 years and come here, and then for another year, and then there you go.
There's
You've
your
qualified.
3 years. Or maybe your parents brought you here when you were very little, say at age 2, and you left when you were 6. And now you've been living the vast majority of your life somewhere else, maybe in Europe, let's say. And
If
then,
you have kids.
yeah, are they now Canadian citizens because you haven't been living in Canada for 20 plus years?
By this law, the answer may
Is
be yes. And it's also for adopted kids as well. So if your parents had lived in Canada for 3 years and you're living in like Eastern Europe or Australia or something like that, and they adopted you, you get to be a Canadian citizen. This is the crazy part about this law. So while the law is good in that they are trying to put this in to avoid every single child becoming a Canadian citizen, regardless of how much time that their parents spend in Canada, that's a bad thing if that were to happen, and that's why this law is being put into place to prevent that from happening as a result of the court ruling. They really need to look at what substantial connection to Canada is.
So you could argue on the one hand that this law is a good thing because it prevents absolutely every child who is born of a Canadian citizen from claiming Canadian citizenship. But on the other hand, I don't think it goes far enough. 3 years at some point in your lifetime, then to be able to pass on your citizenship to your child, it doesn't seem as if it goes far enough. As we said, you could be born somewhere else, lived in Canada for 3 years, completely left the country as a child and never gone back, and then your children born somewhere else in the world could have Canadian citizenship and all the rights and advantages that comes with it. Now, we want to protect our citizenship. We want Canadians who are proud of our country. We want Canadians who share our values. We want Canadians who will contribute to our country, to our economy. We don't want Canadians of convenience. And I'm hoping that in the later stages of this bill, maybe second, third reading, or even committee, that they will inspect this 3-year rule and make it a little bit more robust. Because as we've already pointed out, there are issues with saying to somebody, well, you can pass on your citizenship as long as you spend at least 3 years at some point in your life here in Canada as a citizen.
Right. So we will be following this bill with great interest. It's good that they're actually introducing this bill, but there's definitely some issues with it that need to be addressed. So we'll stick with it, and as soon as we have an update, we'll let you know.